One of the issues in history, one of the many issues in history, I suppose, is always, when you look at history, what do you see? And part of the discussion we have to have is, what do you see? Because there's a question in it, why is that important to you? Because the selection of facts in history is ultimately not determined by what happened, it's determined by what it is we think it is important to see. And history is always a relationship between now and then. It is not just the story of then. There's an awful lot happened then which we don't talk about, and there's an awful lot happening now which we're not prioritising. So the discussion of history is not actually what happened then, it is what is important for us to see. Otherwise you couldn't explain why all of a sudden women's history is taken off, black history is taken off, all of these different things. They're not a result of the facts not being there, they're a result of the changing realities in the modern world, which are meaning that those things are now important to see. And so history, in many ways, it would probably be easier if we had the same language formation as French or German, actually, where history and story are the same word. They're the same word. Geschichte and histoire are the same word. And actually in English, because we distinguish between story and history, we have some notion that we are constructing, telling ourselves, trying to find what story makes sense. It's a sense-making process out of where we are now. And one of our issues we have therefore to talk about is the issue which I understand Brandon talked about yesterday, which is, where is it we want to go? What is the story we have to tell ourselves, both about how we got ourselves into this relationship, and also what in that story might tell us positively and negatively about where we want to go. And I think if we're not honest that that is part of the issue, that's actually a contested issue in our society about where it is we want to go. And part of our problem is not what happened, it is that we are not yet at a point where we have concluded the discussion about where it is we want to go. And that's what makes this such an endlessly circular conversation. And so part of the story might have to be, and I won't talk about this too long, we might do that together, is we might have to ask the question not just what is history, but why does that seem important to you? Why does history matter to us? Because in that conversation we might begin to meet each other in a slightly different way about how we're approaching this. This is what I want to say to you. This is what is important to me. And this is a living reality for people in Northern Ireland. This is not my experience of teaching history, I've done this before, or in teaching politics in the university, it's an interesting one, given that the university is a kind of common space, shared space, at least theoretically, and the students are definitely coming from different places right across it, and my particular students are always politically, at least at some level, interested because they've chosen to do a politics course, and so these are people who, one has to assume want this, and even then what is really clear is their ability to go into the emotional life of this story for them is very difficult. But the main point we have to talk about here is this story has an emotional life. And part of the problem of teaching history as if it does not have an emotional life is that it doesn't connect. And there's a double-sidedness to that, which is at one level or other, one of the tasks must be to recognise that that's where it is, and another level is how can we use evidence and the process of trying to come to shared conclusions that comes out of that, and also to see what is still disputed and what is understood in different ways. How can we use that intellectual process to create some framework within which we actually see each other again? It provides that kind of transcendent framework. So it is something again between those two things. If it doesn't do enough to engage people emotionally, I think people feel that they're just being propagandized, they're being talked at from the front, they're being given a view of history which is the view of the teacher and is shaped and formed in a way which doesn't take into account something which matters to them. And the second part is that we have to at the other level, insist, however, that staying there won't work. The purpose of the enterprise here is to try to come together and look at, well, how can we use evidence to help us challenge, ask questions, also reconfigure what it is we're doing, and at least make the process of looking something that we begin to do together. Because if we start looking at each other's histories in different ways, what I think history offers us is an opportunity to look together in a different way, to start to look together. And I think that's also true of all the opportunities, and why, like museums and so on, and heritage situations, is they provide spaces where people can see things they didn't see before, and as a result they are able to change slightly. So there's a whole lot of things that I could talk about, and I need to be constrained a little bit. So I'm going to just do two things. First of all, about that teaching process. I think that what it showed me is, when I stand in the front of the room, there's still this kind of vestige of the old-fashioned teaching mode where, there's a teacher and a learner. And that's reality. I mean, that's the bottom line of it. The difference in teaching politics and history is actually that my authority, that question I asked you at the beginning, is in fundamental dispute from the beginning. My students do not sit there going, let this man teach us the truth. They go, who's your man? Essentially, especially if they don't know it. And not so much now, but in the past, certainly the thing which made me safe was they feared each other more than they feared me. And I set the exam, which was fine. But in terms of learning, in terms of really learning, in other words, knowing something I didn't know before, or moving from one place to another, because learning is an active verb, none of that happened. Large parts of the energy in the room is regarded as defending themselves against me. So part of my task, I think, was to recognize that that was part of reality, and to try to encourage them to say, well, instead of using the moments of reaction, anger or fear or rejection or whatever that is, as a negative, is it possible to turn those into the actual points where this is something interesting, something's at stake here, this is about me, and actually create context within which some of that could be explored. But I suppose I want to say to you, first of all, what it said to me was, this is not history in which people aren't invested in the outcome. The bottom line is that a change, because this word identity, I now think very usefully, can be kind of parsed in English around this. It obviously has the same etymological root as identical. In other words, this process of identifying means I locate my own sense-making, my own sense in something else. It's a relational process. In other words, I am a man, I am a woman, I am Irish, I am British, I am whatever you want to do. But the identity is a relational word. It always says there's something about me which is reflecting and reflected in that reality. And so if I tell a story, if identity in this community has come, in other words, people have tied their identity to something in politics, at least part of their identity, it's not their whole identity, but part of their identity is something in politics, and I change the story, it changes them necessarily. This is not an external story. This is an internal experience. It's also a fundamental risk. Teaching history is extremely risky in this community because it risks actually not simply that the story changes externally. This is not something you look at in some kind of objective world. This is something you're looking at from the inside. And therefore, it is an inevitably emotional experience. Somewhere along the line, if I change this story, I change my relationships with everybody else. I change. I can no longer go back to my family and look at them in the same way. The story they told me, and that is deeply unsettling. Particularly if those stories are told to you in a way which is, this is who we are. Or if they're part of a traumatic experience of family in which there is within the family an embedded reality, which is this is what happened, and you have to defend that. So this is a risky process. Number two, my experience of these is that they are highly, because of this emotionality, that's exactly what people want to avoid. Both teachers and pupils. Teachers are not used to a situation in which what they have to manage is an open-ended emotional response. It's not, you don't get to the end of the lesson without something might have happened in the middle of that lesson which you have to manage. And most teachers don't want to go anywhere near that, to be honest with you, because they don't themselves know because they're reacting in the middle of that too. And so part of again, the crisis of authority, which is people shy away from that. And in my experience, the Northern Ireland mode kicks in, which is whatever you say nothing. Contain this, control this, avoid this, because of good reasons. Because if it's not contained and it's not controlled, it will be disastrous. It will be disastrous. And that's not unwise either, by the way. It strikes me as being a wise way to get through your life, is just stay away from it. But the problematic of it is that finding the places where it is actually safe to talk about this, which is why we do have to talk about education in a much more holistic way if we're going to be serious about this. This isn't going to be done from the front of the classroom at the moment. Possibly that might be the last place we can do it from. It might be the first place for some people if you have a teacher who is entirely safe with this stuff. But we have to look at it in informal settings and in youth work where there is more room to deal with that kind of open-endedness and also skill. We have to look at it in museums where people can do it at distance and see it at a certain degree of distance, and also come back. You can use film, you can use public education, you can use television. There are all sorts of but the really big question is, how do I engage in this story in a way which actually releases this in a healing way? My experience of this actually is that what it drives people back to is what is called in the book, on Northern Ireland anyway, single identity work. And single identity work basically is a synonym for a setting in which this emotion is handled in a uniform way. You're given an ordering story which you can trust. And you can trust the teacher. So as long as it's one of ours, that we'll get it there. And this risk factor of how do we together acknowledge we're engaging in risk is important. Okay? And part of that is we are both identify with our own story and reject some of the complexities of other people's stories which run across that story if it seems to undermine the authority of our own position, and if it leaves us in some kind of degree of uncertainty about all of these things. So this is just, it's not, I don't want to labour this point too long. I simply want to say that the teaching of history is partly a problem which goes back to this question I started with. What's the authority here? What's the teaching authority? And also, what is how do we cope with the fact that we are not simply dealing with a set of rational facts? We're dealing with a group of people who are engaging in change, which is also about them. And if we don't understand that, and also that we have to be open to changing our own story as a result of what we hear in that classroom. The story I tell is absolutely impacted on by the people I've listened to over the years. In other words, every single time you have to know, you might hear a version of this which actually totally now runs across what I just thought there before. That's interesting. That's interesting. And it might not even make sense initially. There may be a process in which the sense-making process takes time to settle, because the contradictions, once you open that up, the contradictions of people's experiences are also very interesting, and all sorts of complexities come into the picture.